A person in a group of 30 walked into the forest and did not come back. We don't know their name. We don't know if they were taken by a predator or drowned or simply lost or chose to go. We know it happened because it always happens. And here is what made it different from every other kind of loss. There was no body. You live in a world with systems for this. Searches, investigations, legal declarations of death, rituals that proceed even in absence. The paperwork exists specifically because the uncertainty is unbearable without structure. They had none of that. Just the absence. The place around the fire where someone used to sit. The name that kept almost being called. The specific knowledge, where the tubers grew, how to read a certain animal's tracks that existed only in one mind and was now unreachable. So what does a group do with a loss that has no ending, no body, no proof? The archaeological record of how ancient humans handled death is surprisingly rich and consistently surprising. At Arene Candide in Italy, archaeologists uncovered the grave of a 15-year-old boy killed by a bear attack approximately 28,000 years ago. He was not abandoned at the site of the attack. His community carried him to a designated cave, packed his wounds, and stayed with him as he died. Then they prepared a bed of red ochre, adorned him with hundreds of perforated shells, deer canines, mammoth ivory pendants, and decorated elk antler batons, and buried him. Archaeologists called him Il Principe, the prince, not because of his status, but because of what his burial said about how much he mattered. At Sunghir in Russia, dated to approximately 34,000 years ago, two adolescents were buried head-to-head with more than 10,000 mammoth ivory beads, each bead individually carved and sewn onto clothing. The labor required to produce those beads has been estimated at thousands of hours of work, for children who died, from a group that barely had enough to eat. What does that tell you about what grief was already doing tens of thousands of years ago? Here's the finding that pushes this even further back. Burial. The deliberate placement of a body in a prepared location is documented in the archaeological record from at least 120,000 years ago. Some researchers argue for even earlier examples. What is certain is that by the time anatomically modern humans appear in the record, ritual treatment of the dead was already established behavior. More striking, the earliest burials often show evidence of returning to the site, bones moved, rearranged, partially curated, suggesting that communities came back to places where their dead were interred, not once, but repeatedly. The site of a death was not abandoned, it was maintained. It became a place with meaning that the living continued to reference. This is not just emotional behavior. This is the beginning of something that no other species does, using the locations of the dead as anchors for the memory of the living. So what was being anchored? To understand what ancient humans were doing when they buried their dead, you have to understand what they were managing psychologically and why the management was necessary for the group to function. Grief, in the evolutionary sense, is not primarily about the grieving individual. It is a signal, a costly, physiologically disruptive response that communicates to the social group. This relationship mattered. The person who is gone was not interchangeable. Their absence is not the same as a stranger's absence. This matters because, in a group of 30 people who depend on each other for everything, the loss of one member is a structural event. Tasks need redistribution. The social network needs reorientation. Children who depended on the absent person need alternate support. And the group needs to process, together, that something significant has happened, not as an abstraction, but as a social reality that reshapes the group's configuration going forward. Ritual grief, visible, communal, structured, does this processing. It signals to every member of the group simultaneously, this happened, it matters, we are acknowledging it together. And it creates a container for the disruptive emotions of individual grief that might otherwise, in a group dependent on cooperation, produce behavioral instability. Paul Rosenblatt, An anthropologist who conducted a cross-cultural study of grief practices found that grieving rituals appear in virtually every documented human culture. The specific forms vary enormously, from intense to restrained, from brief to prolonged. What doesn't vary is the presence of some structured communal acknowledgement of significant loss. The behavior appears to be universal, but disappearance, a loss without a body, without confirmation of death, without a moment of finality, creates a specific psychological problem that burial cannot solve. Ambiguous loss, as psychologist Pauline Boss named it, is grief without closure. The person may be dead, the person may not be dead. The relationship is severed but not ended. The grieving process, which in normally structured grief moves towards some kind of accommodation with the loss, cannot complete itself because the loss itself remains unresolved. Boss's research on ambiguous loss, developed from studying families of soldiers missing in action, among other populations, found that it is associated with higher rates of prolonged grief, depression, and family dysfunction than confirmed death. The brain keeps the relationship open in a specific, metabolically expensive way. The absence that has no confirmed ending cannot be properly filed away, and the system keeps returning to it. Ancient humans almost certainly experienced ambiguous loss regularly. People disappeared in the wilderness. They were taken by predators whose remains left no trace of the human they consumed. They drowned in rivers. They simply failed to return, and the group, with no way to confirm what had happened, faced exactly the psychological problem Boss described: a loss with no structure to hold it. What the archaeological evidence suggests is that ancient humans solved this problem, at least partially, through proactive ritual. Not waiting for confirmation of death, but creating ceremonies that acknowledged the absence itself, creating a social structure around the loss even when the biological facts remained unknown. Ethnographic evidence from cultures that deal with frequent disappearance, fishing communities, nomadic groups who regularly lost members to terrain and weather, consistently shows the same pattern. Ritual for the missing, not just for the confirmed dead. A naming, a marking, a communal acknowledgement that someone was here and is now absent, regardless of the eventual biological truth. The ritual wasn't for the person who was gone, it was for the people who remained. Here's what the labor invested in ancient burials actually measures. The 10,000 mammoth ivory beads at Sunghir have been estimated to represent approximately 10,000 hours of carving work. For a group operating near subsistence margins, 10,000 hours of labor devoted to burial goods is a significant economic investment. Some researchers have argued that this kind of elaborate burial for specific individuals, particularly young individuals with unusual status or circumstances of death, represents an attempt to manage the social disruption caused by their loss. The more disruptive the loss, the more central the person was to the group's function, the more labor went into the ritual that acknowledged it. This is not conspicuous consumption. This is emotional and social infrastructure, the group investing resources in the process of collective grieving because that process was itself essential to the group's continued ability to function. The ceremony was the cost of staying together afterward. There's a deeper layer to how ancient humans dealt with loss, and it shows up in something that became one of the most powerful technologies humans ever developed. Stories. The cross-cultural universality of ancestor veneration, honoring, remembering, and in many cultures actively communicating with the dead, has been documented across virtually every human society on Earth. The forms vary from simple grave visits to elaborate ancestor shrines to complex ritual systems. What doesn't vary is the impulse, keeping the absent present through narrative and ritual. Polly Wiesner's research on Zhu/Huanzi nighttime storytelling documented that a significant portion of campfire stories were about people who were no longer present, ancestors, deceased elders, people from neighboring groups who had died. The absent were kept alive in story. Their knowledge, their characteristics, their mistakes and triumphs were transmitted forward in a form that could be accessed even though the person could not. This is the human solution to the problem of biological mortality. If the body is gone, preserve the pattern. Make the person's accumulated knowledge, personality, and relational significance available to the group through narrative, through the repeated telling of who they were and what they knew and what happened to them. The group around the fire telling stories about a person who had disappeared into the forest was not engaging in empty ceremony. They were performing a knowledge preservation function. The specific ecological knowledge that person held could be partially reconstructed through collective memory. The social relationships they had maintained could be redistributed and tended through the act of talking about them. The loss could be partially metabolized through the telling. And here's what this means for the specific problem of disappearance: A. Loss without a body. The absence of a corpse removes the biological finality that normally anchors the transition from grief to accommodation. But story does not require a body. You can tell the story of someone who walked into the forest and did not come back. You can tell it many times. And in the telling, the group creates a shared narrative around the loss that serves the same function a burial serves, not ending the grief, but giving it structure. Modern grief research has converged on a similar conclusion. Narrative processing, the act of constructing a coherent story around a loss, assigning it meaning within the larger arc of one's life, is one of the most consistently effective mechanisms for working through grief. Not suppressing it, not analyzing it, but storying it, turning the raw experience of loss into a narrative with structure, context, and meaning. This is what ancient humans were doing around the fire. This is what the stories about the missing person accomplished. Not closure, that particular promise is largely a myth, and ambiguous loss makes it obviously impossible. But structure, a way of holding the loss that allowed the group to keep functioning. The grief was real. The ritual was how they stayed together inside it. Step back, and the human response to loss looks less like a cultural accident and more like an evolved technology. The elaborate burial goods, the maintained grave sites, the ancestor stories told by firelight for thousands of years, the rituals for the missing as well as the confirmed dead. These are not sentiment. They are the group's method of metabolizing loss without fragmenting. The labor invested in grief rituals was not wasted. It was what allowed the group to lose a member, sometimes a central, irreplaceable member, and continue functioning. The ceremony was the cost of coherence. The story was the technology that kept the absent person's knowledge and relational significance available to the group that survived them. You are the product of groups that grieved well enough to stay together. The grief you feel when someone is gone is the ancient signal running exactly as designed. This relationship mattered, this loss is real, and the community needs to acknowledge it together so it can survive it together. The fire kept burning. The story kept going. The group stayed whole. Here's the one thing. If you are carrying a loss that has no ending, someone who disappeared from your life without a clear conclusion, someone whose absence is ambiguous and unresolvable, know that the psychological difficulty you're experiencing has a name, a documented structure, and a documented solution. The solution is not closure. Closure is frequently not available for ambiguous loss. The solution is structure. Creating a narrative around the loss that acknowledges the absence without requiring it to be resolved. Telling the story of the person to yourself, to someone you trust, not to end the grief, but to give it a form that can be held. Ancient humans did this around fires, in groups, with stories that were told again and again until the shape of the loss became familiar. The loss didn't go away. It became something the group knew how to carry. You can do the same. Tell the story. Let it take its shape. You don't need an ending for it to have a form. And if the idea that human grief is a technology for group survival, not just a personal experience, reframes how you think about loss, good. Because the next loss that ancient humans had to manage was not a person, it was a season. What ancient humans did when the food ran out, and the system they built that still runs inside you every time you open the refrigerator, that one's next.